Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for November 8th, 2020. We are continuing our study in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. This quarter has been on Genesis Part 1, and we are ready for Lesson 10. As we look at Lesson 10, it's entitled Abram and Lot, and it is taken from Genesis chapter 13, verses 1 through 18. And so Genesis 13, 1 through 18, if you have your Bibles, you can be turning there. I want to remind you, if you're viewing this on Sunday morning, that we are still just live stream only for our Sunday worship service today. And then the elders will meet, make a decision on where we go from here. And so appreciate you taking time to view this study, and we'll jump right into it. The author in the little book begins with an introduction that we want to read together. He said, Lot was the son of Haran, the grandson of Terah. This made him the nephew of Abram. His father Haran died in his native land in Ur of the Chaldees. Consequently, when Abram heeded God's call and left Ur, Lot was part of the company. If Abram felt personally responsible for Lot's care, the text does not say. It does, however, reveal difficulties that resulted because of Lot. Making this point, Longman observed, while the narrator never states that Lot should have been left behind, Lot's presence brings more than its share of trouble to Abraham, and may be a way of showing that Abraham would have been more consistently obedient by leaving him behind. Before Abram and his band came to Canaan, they spent some time in Haran. This is where his father Terah died. Although we do not know how long Abram remained in this location, it was long enough to accumulate both possessions and servants. Importantly, Abram was not the only one who had great possessions, for Lot had flocks and herds and tents of his own. In fact, Genesis 13:6 reports that the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. Consequently, conflict arose between the herdsmen of Lot and the herdsmen of Abram. The groups likely competed for the best land to graze their flocks and herds. Neither group wanted to yield to the other. Rather than allowing the trouble to intensify and boil over, Abram intervened. He said, Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. His words are reminiscent of his great-grandson Joseph's, who instructed his brothers, do not quarrel on the way. Abram's words to Lot also parallel the wise approach advocated in Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. Had Abram exercised authority over Lot, irreparable harm might have occurred. Their relationship could have been severed, but because of his humility, their bonds remained. As we seek to navigate the conflicts that arise in our interpersonal relationships, we would do well to learn from Abram's example. Rather than acting pridefully, we must exhibit humility. Paul's instruction to the Philippians is relevant. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interest of others. Philippians 2:3 and 4. We'd also do well to remember what Paul told the churches of Galatia. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another. Galatians 5:14 and 15. Be careful how you treat others, especially your brethren. That brings us to verse 1 now as we begin this study in Genesis chapter 13. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot went with him to the south. In Genesis 13 and verse 1, we see this beginning. They're coming up from Egypt. Well, the book reminds us of what had taken place in Egypt. After Abram's lie regarding Sarai's identity was discovered by Pharaoh, he and his company were sent away from Egypt. The text does not mention how long he spent there or whether the famine that drove him there had ended. You recall that there was a famine in the land where he was at, and so that's the reason they had gone to Egypt in the first place. It simply reports, and it quotes verse 1. The word south here, in the New King James Version, it says that they went to the south, is used to describe the Negev. According to Kissling, the Negev was the semi-desert region in the southern portion of ancient Palestine, which allowed only for subsistence agriculture or Bedouin shepherding. One can imagine the herdsmen of Abram and Lot struggling to provide for their vast flocks and herds as they passed through the sea, or through this area, And so they're in an area that's not, at the moment, that's not going to be very good for what they're seeking to do with their livestock and everything. In verse 2, we read that Abram was rich, though, in livestock, in silver, and in gold. The author of the book says that much of this wealth was likely what Pharaoh gave to him in an attempt to secure Sarai. Regardless, the desert can hardly sustain vast flocks and herds. So what's going to happen as a result of that? Well, verse 3. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. The author of the book said before his journey to Egypt, Abram had pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. He had also built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. In fact, the word Bethel means house of God. Upon his return, he went back to the altar and again called on the name of the Lord. Regarding his actions, Hamilton wrote, "Is he glad to have put Egypt behind him? Does the place of worship become the place of contrition? If it is, the text is silent about any remorse or repentance on Abram's part. But at least Abram has left behind the unknown and the threatening, and is now back in the familiar. But more importantly, in the place where he had earlier built an altar and called on the name of his God. Not once while he was in Egypt did Abram erect monuments or invoke his deity." And so we see Abram back here. We see him once again worshiping. Interestingly enough, as we look at our text, we'll notice that the text begins, once we get to verse 4, with him worshiping, and our text in verse 18 ends with him doing the same. In verse 5, we read, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents. And so it wasn't just that Abram had gained much wealth as they had journeyed, and we see that the same has happened for Lot as well. Both of them now have great possessions. Both of them have grown into large groups. And as a result of that, there's going to be some issues. In verse 6, we read that the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And so we've reached a point where it's not possible for Lot and Abram to occupy the same area because of their possessions, because of their herds, because of the amount of space that is needed for all of these things. And so what happens? Well, in verse 7 we see that there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. In the little book on page 108, he begins to talk about, on page 109, he begins to talk about what's going on here. He says, as if the shortages they faced because of one another were not enough, they also had to deal with the presence of hostile groups living in the land. Nevertheless, Stedman noted, there is a touch of irony in the note that the Canaanites and Perizzites were living in the land. They could occupy this land together, but Abram and Lot could not. This should serve as a warning to the people of God everywhere. It is truly a shame when worldly individuals get along with one another better than those who profess to be followers of Christ. I thought that was a really interesting note that he puts in there. Here we have the Canaanites and the Perizzites dwelling in the land. Evidently, they're able to dwell together without issue. But we see that Lot and Abram cannot. As I look through my life, sometimes some of the most harshest things that have been said to me or have been done came from those who profess to be Christians, who profess to be followers of Christ. Friends, that just shouldn't be the case. If we're following Christ, then we're going to exhibit a Christ-like attitude in our dealings and our talking and everything that we do. And so it should never be the case that, as the author points out here, that should never be the case that individuals of the world get along better than those who are Christians. Also, something I think that's interesting about this little note that the Canaanites and Perizzites then dwelt in the land, I think it might also point us to the fact that there were those in the land that were watching. They were watching to see how these Hebrews, how Abraham and how Lot were going to handle this dispute. And it's a reminder to us as Christians that people are watching. They're watching how we live our lives. They're watching how we interact with each other. They're watching how we deal with problems that arise. And friends, it makes a difference, the example that we set before them. You think about just the idea of they're watching to see if what we teach and profess is what we actually put into practice. Jesus said in John 13 that they would know us by our love. Now, that love is a characteristic that people should be able to see. It should be seen in our words and in our actions. And so the Canaanites and Perizzites dwelling in the land, we see that they were able to do it without issue, but also maybe they were watching to see what took place between Abram and between Lot. In verse 8, so Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren." I love that phrase that he puts there at the end. Why should there not be any strife between us? Because we're brethren. In this case, they were literally, physically family. Abraham was Lot's uncle, but on the other hand, they're both followers of God, and so they were brethren in that sense as well. And so any strife between us and fellow Christians, that's something that needs to be addressed. That's something that needs to be handled, needs to be dealt with and then done away with. And that's what we see Abram trying to do here with Lot. Verse 9, "Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go to the left." On page 110, the author says, "This proposal is worthy of our attention for several reasons." And he gives three in all here. First, Abram spoke kindly rather than harshly. Considering his approach, Gangle and Brammer wrote how easy it would have been for Abram to say to his nephew, "Look, you are just along for the ride here. God gave me the vision, God gave me the land, so you settle your people down, or you are history." But Abram had matured a bit since his Egyptian fiasco. And so the first thing we see here is that Abram spoke kindly rather than harshly. Second, Abram valued his relationship with Lot more than his possessions. According to Gresham, Abraham's statement, "We are brethren," could be translated, "Men should not quarrel, let alone brothers." Third, Abram attempted to resolve the problem swiftly before it escalated. This is also the advice of Proverbs 17:14. "The beginning of strife is like releasing water. Therefore stop contention before a quarrel starts." And so we have three really good principles set forth here in what Abraham did. Principles that will help us as we deal with issues and relationships with others. First off, he spoke kindly instead of harshly. Man, what a difference that would make in the world in which we live if people would take up that first one. You know, when the conversation starts with someone yelling or someone hurling insults, it's not going to go anywhere but downhill fast from right there. And so we see here Abraham speaking kindly rather than harshly. Secondly, we see that Abraham valued the relationship more than his own stuff. And here it talks about his possessions, but we could put a lot of different things. He valued the relationship more than his own pride, valued the relationship more than his own possessions, valued the relationship more than him getting his way. You see, it wasn't all about Abram. Abram realized that this relationship was important, and he valued that. And he placed the value on that above all of these other things. If we value the relationships that we have with other people, well, then a lot of the things that normally would get in the way of a resolution, they're not going to get in the way of that. The third thing that we see Abraham did is he attempted to resolve the problem swiftly. Y'all, the longer an issue sits and festers, the greater it becomes, the harder it becomes to resolve. And so if we want to handle problems in relationships, what we have set forth here by Abram is really good. It's 3 good ways and good things to keep in mind in order to resolve conflict. Something else that interesting here is the fact that, Abram actually had the right as the elder to tell Lot where he was going to go and where he was going to settle. He could have told Lot that, hey, look, I'm the elder, I'm going this way, and you're going to go that way. But we see Abram not exercising that right. Just because we have the right to do something doesn't always necessarily mean that we should do that. And we see that here in Abram as well. Also on page 111, there's something interesting. I never thought about this, but something interesting that the author puts forth that I just wanted to bring up. He said Abraham's willingness to allow Lot to choose his habitation is certainly remarkable. John H. Selimer observed, Abraham is on the verge of giving the promised land to Lot. What is particularly striking about Abraham's offer is that in his subsequent narrative, Lot is shown to be the father of the Ammonites and the Moabites. Abraham is about to hand the promised land over to the same people who, in the author's own day and throughout Israel's subsequent history, were the primary obstacle to the fulfillment of the promise. Thanks to Abraham, the promise seems to teeter on the whim of the father of the Moabites. Whether this is how the event should be viewed, Abram's risk paid off. Lot chose to leave the promised land in favor of greener pastures. I never thought about that whether or not Abram settles right here in the promised land or whether Lot does, it is left up to Lot at this point. Lot, who would later be the father, as the author points out, of the Moabites and the Ammonites, 2 groups that were constantly a thorn in the side of the Israelite nation. But Lot makes his choice. In verse 10, and Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. And so what happens? Lot looks up. It says he lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan. He's looking out. He sees this area that is well watered. Water was something that was always important with the lifestyle that these men were living. With lots of herds, water would be something that would be essential. We see that it was like the garden of the Lord. We assume a reference back to the Garden of Eden, how the Garden of Eden was well watered. Also, he describes it as like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar, an area that had plentiful water. The author of the little book on page 111 says, unfortunately for Lot, the location of his new abode, Sodom, was as wicked as it was beautiful. His failure to consider more than appearance proved extremely costly. Lot is looking simply on the outward appearance. And as a result, as we know the rest of the account, that's going to prove very costly for him. The author of the big book, and I know not many of you have this, he talks some about the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. He says no one knows exactly where the ancient city of Sodom or its neighbor Gomorrah were located. Modern researchers have thought the names Sodom and Gomorrah have turned up elsewhere, but with a great deal of archaeological data, results are disputed. What is not disputed is that the Jordan forms part of a great rift valley that stretches southward into Africa. In modern times, paleontologists have found what they call hominid remains in portions of the valley as it stretches into Ethiopia. Tradition has it that the remains of Sodom are to be found beneath the northern waters of the Dead Sea. The waters of the Dead Sea are much more mineral rich than the Great Salt Lake of Utah or any comparable body. Not without reason, the sea is said to be dead. It is crystal clear, no algae, no scum mars its surface, but because of its minerals, bathers need to wash deposits from their bodies immediately after a plunge. And so this area that Lot settles, we haven't located Sodom and Gomorrah, but you and I know because of the biblical account why that is. It was destroyed. It was burned. Now, verse 11, then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. And so Lot and Abram have now separated. Lot unfortunately looked and saw the beauty of the area, and that is where he is going to travel to. Something else that I thought, just as a side note, I don't know how many who are watching this are unmarried. Obviously, for a person to get married, there's going to be some attraction to that individual, the opposite sex, but it's important not to just look at the appearance of a person. It's not just about what's on the outside, it's also about what's on the inside. What kind of person is that? Is this person who you are looking to choose as your spouse, is this someone who puts his or her needs first before everyone else, or is this someone who seeks to help others? Is this someone who puts their needs before their own? Is this someone who is caring and compassionate? Is this someone who is nurturing? You know, those are all qualities that are important. And that actually, when it's all said and done, are more important than just mere appearance. If Lot would have thought about the inhabitants of the area that he is looking at and not just looking at the beauty of the appearance, he might have chose differently. In verse 12, it says that Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. Verse 13 gives us a little foreshadowing of what's to come. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. Of course, that's going to come in play in just a few short chapters with what takes place with Sodom and Gomorrah. In verse 14, and the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. It's at this point that God begins now to restate the promise that he had made to Abram before. And I think there's a phrase here in verse 14 that gives us some insight on something. The phrase, after Lot had separated from him. It wasn't until this point that God now restates the promise. It's why I believe that Abram was not fully obedient to what God had told him to do when he brought Lot along with him. God had told him to separate from his family, but yet he held on to Lot. Now, obviously, that didn't mean that he had to separate from Sarai. That's his wife. But I do believe that it should have meant that he separated himself from Lot, but he didn't do that. But now at this point, God said to Abram after Lot had separated from him. And so now that he is fully obeyed, the promise begins to be restated. He tells him to lift his eyes and basically look everywhere. Verse 15, for all the land which you see I give to you and to your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. The author of our book quotes from Guy and Woods. He says, summarizing this section, Woods wrote, this renewal of the promise included both the promise of a people, descendants, to come from Abram, and the promise of a land to be given them. Verse 18, then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. Once again, we see in Abram a mind to worship. He builds an altar to worship to the God of heaven. On page 112, the author closes out with a couple of applications that we want to notice. After Abram's return from Egypt, worship becomes a priority. When he came to the altar near Bethel, he called on the name of the Lord. When he settled down at Hebron, he built an altar there to the Lord. It is easy to allow the trials and events of life to distract us. Nevertheless, we must make sure to praise and honor God properly. I thought this was very interesting, especially considering the time in which we find ourselves right now. Obviously, when the author wrote this book, he had no clue what 2020 was going to bring. But as we look at the year that we've had, all the things that have been going on, most recently the presidential election, there are so many things, as he writes here, that it's easy to allow the trials and events of life to distract us. It would be so easy for that to happen in a year like we've been having. But we must remember to continue to put God first, to continue make worship of Him a priority. Hopefully, after this week, we'll be able to resume being in person and worshiping together. And I hope and pray that you're going to make that a priority. Friends, that's important. It's so important that we come together, that we worship the God of heaven. We see that in the life of Abram, and we need to imitate that in our lives as well. The final application reads, the way Abram handled his conflict with Lot stands as a model for us today. And we talked about that some, and noticing those 3 steps that we see. Rather than allowing his pride or emotions to cloud his judgment. Wow, don't we see that a lot today? We see that even in us, Christian. We have a tendency to allow our emotions and our pride to cloud our judgment. Instead of allowing that to happen, Abram acknowledged the importance of their relationship. We are brethren. We would do well to remember this when dealing with one another today. The author of the big book closes out talking about Lot's choice. He said the separation of Abram and Sarai from Lot is a story from Genesis well known to Christians. Lot illustrates in his behavior the way that people sometimes make small choices that later loom large. One suspects Lot would have argued he was strong enough in faith to be unaffected by the wickedness of the men of Sodom, but in time it wore on him. In the end, not only did most of the family of Lot perish with the people of Sodom, but he managed to preserve his descendants, the Moabites and the Ammonites, only through incest. And so we see here that what might have seemed like a small choice ended up being a very big choice. And we all face choices each day. Let's make sure that we're making choices that honor the God of heaven. I want to thank you once again for taking time out of your day and to study God's Word with us. We'll continue to go through this material. In fact, the new books have already come in. We've still got, I think, 3 more lessons in this one, and then we'll move to Genesis Part 2. Thanks for listening. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay prayerful, and I hope that you have a good day.